We will remove their nuclear threat, even if it means striking all of Iran's hidden facilities. With these words, Israeli officials delivered a chilling warning that left observers reeling, wondering if this flashpoint might ignite the largest conflict in the region since the start of the 21st century. Could the world be on the brink of an explosive face-off that will define the fate of multiple nations and shape global politics for years to come? Today, we will dive deep into the labyrinth of diplomatic tensions and cascading threats that revolve around the question of nuclear capabilities in Iran, the unrelenting resolve of Israel to stop them, and the overarching role of the United States in deciding whether to launch an actual military strike or seek a high-stakes diplomatic resolution. In this in-depth analysis, we will explore how one provocative statement can spark an entire chain reaction, what President Donald Trump's 2 weeks ultimatum truly signifies, and why Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists his country is poised to unleash massive force if Tehran's nuclear ambitions are not curtailed. But hold on, this is just the beginning. In this extensive breakdown, you will discover chilling accounts from eyewitnesses on the ground, shocking revelations about top-secret nuclear facilities buried deep beneath Iranian mountains, and a candid, behind-the-scenes perspective on what might happen if negotiations fail. We will piece together the puzzle step by step, identifying challenges, alliances, and potential misunderstandings that could suck the whole region into armed conflict. Want to be kept informed of every twist in this unfolding drama? Stick with us. And if you find yourself intrigued by any of these revelations, feel free to let us know you appreciate it. Go ahead and leave a show of support or if you value this kind of in-depth reflection. Let's get started. The tension we witness today did not arise without a fuse. For years, Israel has accused Iran of secretly advancing a nuclear weapons program, while Tehran repeatedly denies that it seeks anything but peaceful, civilian-grade nuclear energy. To observers, the exact truth is blurred by a barrage of diplomatic spin, intelligence leaks, and official statements that never fully align. Then, in a dramatic twist, confirmed Israeli airstrikes targeted Iranian facilities rumored to be linked to uranium enrichment and ballistic missile development. The Israeli military declared that these decisive operations, carried out with sophisticated fighter jets and standoff missiles, had crippled key Iranian nuclear sites. In response, Iran's military fired back across the border, unleashing drones and ballistic missiles that purportedly hit several Israeli sites, including a hospital in the southern region. Although Iranian officials claimed they targeted military intelligence zones and not civilian locations, the presence of wounded civilians suggests that the lines between strategic and non-strategic sites have blurred. Worldwide, commentators debate the legitimacy of these claims and whether Tehran is purely retaliating or initiating a new bombshell wave of aggression. But scratch the surface, and you discover that both sides have long declared each other their mortal enemies. Both feel threatened, and both roll out biblical or existential language seasoned with relentless patriotism. However, the world cannot set aside one crucial player, the United States. At the center of it all stands President Donald Trump, who is publicly contemplating what he calls peace through strength. As White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt states, the American president remains open to a diplomatic path if it ensures Iran never gains the ability to produce nuclear weapons. Yet, the other side of the coin reveals a readiness for military involvement that could ramp up at any moment should negotiations fail, or if President Trump perceives that Tehran's nuclear ambition remains unstoppable by other means. In an especially strong statement, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu suggested his forces can handle preemptive strikes, but any additional backing from President Trump would be most welcome. Many Israelis see the United States as their staunchest ally, one that could deploy its arsenal of bunker-busting bombs to neutralize subterranean Iranian sites considered impervious to Israeli ordnance. These heavily fortified facilities, including the Fordow Uranium Enrichment Center, are buried beneath layers of earth and stone, presenting a formidable challenge to conventional munitions. On the other side, Iranian officials are quick to highlight the risk of catastrophic reprisals if the US and Israel push too hard. They remind international audiences that Iran has ballistic missile capabilities, advanced drone technology, and branching sphere of influence networks stretching across the Middle East. Such networks could target both Israeli territory and American assets throughout the region. The possibility of a broader, more devastating clash is alarming not only for the direct participants, but for neighboring countries who see themselves at risk of fallout, both literally in the case of nuclear warfare and figuratively if trade routes and diplomatic ties collapse. Now, let us pull back the curtain and examine the U.S. political landscape shaping these heated maneuvers. President Trump has positioned himself as a peacemaker in chief, someone who believes in wielding a big stick but prefers not to swing it unless absolutely necessary. He has signaled to the American public that he is not looking for another entrenched Middle Eastern conflict after years of contentious engagements in the region. Yet critics at home argue that if Washington truly wants no conflict, it should dial down the harsh rhetoric and reduce the perceived pressure on Iran's economy through crippling sanctions. Proponents of the administration's strategy counter that sanctions and the looming threat of force might be the only language Tehran respects. It falls to White House aides and diplomatic envoys to insulate these negotiations. Caroline Leavitt made it clear, negotiations may or may not take place within the next few days or weeks. Until then, the world watches. Observers wonder whether Deborah Jones, head of a hypothetical U.S. delegation, might rush to a closed-door meeting somewhere in Europe, maybe Geneva, to speak face-to-face with Iranian representatives. Also rumored is that President Trump might use back channels to talk with foreign ministers from Germany, France, or Britain who are anxious for a peaceful settlement, but worry they might have little sway if the U.S. and Israel already decided on a more militarized approach. That leads us to the next set of pressing questions. How drastic would an American involvement be if the U.S. decided to support Israel's operation? How soon could it happen, and with what scale of force? Some analysts say a concentrated campaign of surgical strikes might be feasible, limited engagements that aim to degrade Iran's nuclear infrastructure without committing to a full-scale invasion. But any strike, surgical or not, would surely provoke responses from the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, an elite branch of Iran's armed forces that has historically mobilized quickly and effectively. International watchers suspect that should the Revolutionary Guards sense an existential threat to their regime, they will respond across multiple fronts. They are rumored to have sleeper cells or proxies in all corners of the Middle East, from Lebanon's Hezbollah to potential militias as far west as the edge of the Mediterranean. The question then becomes, can the conflict be contained? Or would this spark a chain reaction that engulfs neighbors, disrupts global oil flows, and plunges global markets into disarray? As if to heighten the protagonist versus antagonist drama, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz recently delivered a fiery round of statements centering on Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He openly declared, "Such a man can no longer be allowed to exist," attributing direct blame to Khamenei for everything from rocket attacks on Israeli civilians to repeated declarations calling for the destruction of the Jewish state. Katz's words underscore a difference between merely crippling a nuclear program and eliminating the spiritual and political figurehead behind it. These threats raise concerns among many world leaders who fear that a targeted move to remove or eliminate the supreme leader could escalate hostilities by leaps and bounds. For decades, the question of whether one can dislodge the Iranian leadership from the outside has hovered, but nobody has made a direct attempt, given the almost inevitable spiral into a fierce region-wide conflagration. Evidently, some critics worry that if Katz's stance mirrors that of the rest of the Israeli cabinet, the potential for a stealth assassination or a decapitation strike might be on the table, an even more explosive idea than a conventional military raid. Yet, behind the crescendo of intense rhetoric lies an undeniable desire for peace among certain segments of the global community who realize that an all-out war could be devastating for everyone involved. European diplomats fret that a violent escalation might drastically complicate the precarious nuclear balance in the region, not to mention lead to humanitarian crises and massive refugee flows. For this reason, envoys from Germany, France, and Britain are reportedly stepping up their efforts to hold urgent negotiations with Abbas Araghchi, an Iranian official known for his involvement in nuclear discussions dating back to the prior decade. The hope is to salvage some kind of international agreement that can keep Iran's nuclear program limited to civilian applications. Staunch opponents of any negotiation, however, retort that Iran has repeatedly circumvented such limitations in the past, so new ones might be meaningless if not comprehensively verified. Now, let us consider the viewpoint of everyday citizens caught in the escalating crossfire. In southern Israel, hospital staff at key trauma centers have been forced to treat civilians wounded in missile strikes that Iran insists were aimed at military sites. Meanwhile, in Iran, alarmed families watch the skies for possible Israeli or American planes they fear may target nuclear complexes rumored to be near their villages. Threatening notices from the Israeli military, warning of imminent strikes on Iranian infrastructure, have fueled widespread panic, leading residents to pack up and flee to safer ground. Local Iranian media call this psychological warfare, a tactic designed to rattle nerves and sow confusion amongst civilians. All these flashpoints raise the stakes for President Trump's 2 weeks to decide statement, an ultimatum seen by some commentators as a final countdown. One might ask, they say, will the president side with the hawks who demand action despite the potential fallout, or will he diffuse tensions with a new round of negotiations? The clock is ticking. That is not to mention the near-constant chatter on the so-called rumor mill. Did Washington already greenlight a massive operation? Will the Israeli Air Force see joint American support sooner than expected? Are certain U.S. Navy assets already inching closer to the Gulf? Government spokespeople fiercely deny that any final decision has been made, but the swirl of speculation continues unabated. At this point, you may wonder, how close are we to an irreversible chain of events? The truth lies in the delicate interplay between sworn enemies, uneasy allies, and the global powers that float somewhere in between. The possibility that cooler heads might still prevail is not gone. Moderates on all sides, from Iranian political figures who simply want economic stability for their citizenry to Israeli voices cautioning against unbridled escalation, may yet steer the conversation toward a ceasefire or a comprehensive agreement. For that, though, each side would likely need to make compromises that have proven elusive over many years. Special envoys and behind-the-scenes negotiations in plush hotels might be one way forward. Let us reflect more deeply on the real impetus for such hostility. Israel claims that nothing but lethal force will deter Tehran from crossing the threshold where they can produce a nuclear weapon. Meanwhile, Iran sees nuclear technology as an inalienable right, a key to self-reliance and an insurance policy against external threats, especially from a country that has frequently declared its intention to bomb them. Furthermore, Iranian leadership has endured economic sanctions, sabotage efforts on key scientists, and a range of other perceived aggressions. Each action by one side tends to amplify the other's sense of vulnerability, igniting a vicious cycle. Against this backdrop, President Trump juggles the demands of his base, some clamoring for a firm stance against Tehran, others weary of further military entanglements in the Middle East. One can observe a certain tension as well among foreign policy hawks in Washington, who see an opportunity to weaken Iran's influence, and more dovish voices who argue that war with Iran would be catastrophic. No matter who emerges victorious in the rhetorical skirmishes, the reverberations of a possible U.S. intervention echo ominously across the globe. Another dimension fueling interest is the potential effect on oil supplies. The mere mention of a possible confrontation in the Gulf region can send markets into frenzy, with speculators on perpetual alert for disruptions that affect major shipping lanes. Even though producers have diversified somewhat, a closure of critical paths could spike global energy costs. That, in turn, could rattle economies far beyond the Middle East, prompting world leaders in Asia, Europe, and beyond to pressure Washington and Tehran to find alternatives to open conflict. Meanwhile, the Iranian side tries to rally regional allies. Some factions in neighboring states might surreptitiously support Tehran's stance, believing that a strong stand against Israel is warranted. Others prefer not to be dragged into a potential superpower confrontation. Such a patchwork of stances among Middle Eastern neighbors ensures that, if conflict does erupt, it would not be a simple affair. The mosaic of nations in the region, some with complex historical ties and rivalries, could quickly become entangled in a web of shifting loyalties and opportunistic power plays. Yet we must also remember that talk of war can sometimes serve as a bargaining chip to extract favorable terms in negotiations. President Trump's ultimatum, Israel's vow to continue hitting strategic Iranian facilities, and Iran's retaliatory missile strikes could be choreographed moves in a high-stakes performance where each actor tries to call the other's bluff. History has taught us that parties may threaten to push the button until the last possible moment, only to pivot and sign a grudging arrangement that prevents the unthinkable. At the same time, certain facts on the ground cannot be ignored. Israel's repeated claims of crippling large chunks of Iran's nuclear infrastructure might be a short-term tactic, but can it truly stop a determined program in the long run? In the nuclear age, technology is widely dispersed, and some knowledge cannot be bombed away. Once scientists have the know-how, it might only be a matter of time before the pieces re-emerge, perhaps deeper underground than before. To many analysts, that suggests that, while airstrikes can set back a nuclear program, they rarely fully erase it, especially if the targeted nation has a robust scientific base and external allies. In a televised conversation guaranteed to keep viewers on the edge of their seats, Netanyahu emphasized Israel's capacity to fight alone if necessary, but ended with a telling caveat: all help is welcome. He was referring, presumably, to Washington's willingness to lend advanced munitions, specialized intelligence, and diplomatic cover to legitimize any large-scale mission. Coupled with a statement from certain unconfirmed sources indicating that President Trump may have already signaled readiness to fight, the entire region holds its breath awaiting the next domino to fall. Looking at the scale of suffering that might unfold if these tensions explode into open warfare, humanitarians and civil society groups are pleading for an immediate course correction. Hospitals in southwestern Israel have run emergency drills to prepare for a surge of incoming casualties if Iran escalates missile or drone attacks on heavily populated areas. Meanwhile, videos circulating online show Iranian families in tears, hurriedly hustling valuables into cars while scanning the skyline for advanced jets or missiles plunging from the heavens. Yet, in all the chaos, faint hope remains in the form of diplomacy. Officials from nations that have historically supported peace efforts in the region are appealing to the United Nations, urging an emergency session to address the urgent crisis. Some recall how, in previous years, even at the height of rhetorical escalation, back-channels and second-track dialogues prevented total meltdown. But, once again, it hinges on the willingness of key players to engage in genuine compromise, a thorny proposition when so many red lines have been drawn. If you have followed this saga so far, you might now see just how deeply layered, perilous, and entwined it can be. Are we looking at an unlucky confluence of events where each leader feels trapped by his own declarations and unable to back down without losing face among domestic supporters? Or is there still room for creative statesmanship, a quieter path where both sides can declare victory while stepping away from the brink? Time will tell. Meanwhile, we invite you to make sure you do not miss any subsequent updates on these international tensions. Feel free to show your support by subscribing if you want to stay tuned and be part of a global conversation on the pressing issues at hand. With each passing hour, speculation grows over exactly which strategic sites might be next on Israel's or the United States' target lists if negotiations fail. Some point to the mountainous stronghold near Fordow or the heavy water reactor at Arak, which lies a couple hundred kilometers southeast of Tehran. Others mention the shadowy ballistic missile factories rumored to be scattered throughout remote areas. Military sources in Tel Aviv have bragged that Israeli intelligence can accurately map every significant Iranian research location, while Iranian spokespeople have shot back, claiming that their own intelligence apparatus can pinpoint Israeli vulnerabilities as well, truly an incendiary game of cat and mouse. Meanwhile, an inescapable question looms. How might everyday citizens around the globe be affected by the potential of large-scale conflict in the Middle East? Besides the immediate humanitarian crisis for those living under the specter of missile strikes, global markets could suffer from ballooning oil prices, along with disruptions to shipping lanes around crucial waterways. An escalation could also spark waves of displacement as refugees flee threatened areas, creating a new migration crisis that tests the hospitality and resources of neighboring nations. Perhaps more subtly, the widespread fear and anxiety stirred when two powerful militaries face off in a region with extensive historical tensions can ripple through many societies. Then there is the question of setting a precedent. If the threats escalate and nations begin launching preemptive strikes in the name of stopping nuclear arms, what message does this send to states that feel insecure? Does it encourage them to pursue nuclear arms even faster, convinced that only tangible deterrence can keep them safe from foreign aggression? This question has haunted nuclear proliferation experts since the dawn of the nuclear age. The cycle can become self-fulfilling, in which the fear of disarmament ironically leads to greater impetus to build the ultimate weapon. In that sense, some analysts propose that the path forward lies in robust, enforceable agreements that remove the rationale for nuclear armament. Here is where the so-called nuclear deal notion re-enters the discussion. If the great powers and the Middle Eastern players themselves could craft a credible framework with bulletproof inspection regimes and verifiable limits to ballistic missile testing, maybe a semblance of stability could return. But forging such an agreement would demand enormous trust and willingness to cooperate, two commodities that are in very short supply given the incendiary words traded on all sides. One has to wonder whether personal ambitions and political showmanship overshadow the real stakes. President Trump, known for his social media presence, has frequently sparred with what he calls the fake news, lambasting certain newspapers for allegedly misconstruing his intentions. When the Wall Street Journal reported that he signaled a readiness to strike Iran at short notice, Trump shot back, claiming no one truly knows his plan. Netanyahu, likewise, rides local waves of popularity by positioning himself as the ultimate guardian of Israeli security, a posture that resonates deeply in a land shaped by decades of conflict. At the same time, Ayatollah Khamenei appeals to Iranian patriotism, conjuring images of resilience against foreign intrusions that date back centuries. For the average viewer, it may feel like stepping into a labyrinth of alliances, enmities, and precedents. Each path leads to new complexities. Each potential solution spawns further questions. Yet, we cannot look away because decisions made in these corridors of power will reverberate globally, whether we wish them to or not. This could be the moment that future historians pinpoint as the catalyst for a significant shift in the Middle East's geopolitical landscape. We are left with a critical conclusion. The next 2 weeks may well be decisive. If diplomacy gains traction, we could witness a temporary cessation of hostilities or a new high-profile deal that claims to restrain Tehran's nuclear progress. If, on the other hand, hawkish elements carry the day, the world might see joint U.S.-Israeli military operations targeting Iranian infrastructure. Meanwhile, European allies insist a negotiated compromise is the only path, while some Middle Eastern players whisper that war might be inevitable. Ultimately, as the clock ticks, the lines between rhetoric and action continue to blur. Will cooler heads prevail? Or will the unstoppable force meet the immovable object, creating sparks that could escalate in ways we can only begin to imagine? Stay tuned. Observing how all these diplomatic puzzle pieces shift, combine, and sometimes clash is certain to remain as suspenseful as it is consequential. The next moves made by the various principals, from Washington to Tehran, from Tel Aviv to Berlin, will reveal whether we are heading toward a remarkable breakthrough or an unprecedented calamity. In the days and weeks ahead, watch carefully for any sign of de-escalation or, conversely, an explosive strike that sets a dangerous precedent. For now, that is where the situation rests, precariously balanced on a razor's edge, waiting to see which side tips first.